How's it going, American history students? This is Mr. Bell coming back at you with another video lesson. Today we're going to start Unit 3, and this section of video notes will cover 3.1 and 3.2. 3.2 is super short. We're going to be focusing on what's known as the Federalist Era, a time in which we have our first two major political parties emerge, with Jefferson leading the Democratic Republicans, or the Anti-Federalists, and Alexander Hamilton leading the Federalists. So let's go ahead and get into this. We're going to start with the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion showed the strength of the federal government. So this is going to be the opposite of something like Shays' Rebellion. This is one of the first crises that George Washington faces as President of the United States. And there is an excise tax on whiskey that the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, had come up with in order to pay back the debt from the Revolutionary War. People in Pennsylvania don't want to pay it. They take to the streets. They rebel. These protests turn violent, hence the name rebellion. And then Washington is, faced with a crisis. What does he do? He can't allow what happened in Shays' Rebellion to take place. So now that we have an army, he sends the army to Pennsylvania and quickly puts down the protest, the violent protest, and then you have the strength of the federal government on full display, unlike the weakness with Shays. So this is the opposite of Shays' Rebellion. Judiciary Act of 1789 creates the lower federal court systems. So Article 3 of the Constitution established the Supreme Court, so this is actually incorrect, but this establishes the Federal Court of Appeals and Federal District Court. The Federal Court of Appeals, sometimes known as the Circuit Court. Instead of 9 judges, they have 3 judges. So, again, Article 3 of the Constitution is what sets up the judicial branch. This sets up lower federal courts. Alien and Sedition Acts and Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These two things are linked in history forever. So you need to understand Alien and Sedition Acts to understand the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. This was passed by John Adams. So I'm jumping around here between different presidents, really the first 3 presidents over the course of this unit. Actually, for the first 4 by the end of the unit. However, the Alien and Sedition Acts. So John Adams passes this, and the alien part people are in favor of because they are against, even at this time, illegal immigrants. So it creates limits on citizenship. You must live in the U.S. for 14 years before applying. Deported any illegal aliens, and people were on board with that. What they were not on board with was the sedition part, which made it illegal to criticize John Adams. The media didn't like John Adams. He got very upset about it. So he passed the Sedition Acts. People argued that this violated the First Amendment, violated free speech, because not only was it illegal to criticize him, but the federal government. This is when you get to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. 2 states, Virginia and Kentucky, but the main one I'm going to focus on here is Virginia, decide they're going to opt out. The reason Virginia is key here is because Thomas Jefferson, at this time, is the governor of Virginia. And he uses this as if he was already a very famous individual writing the Declaration of Independence and whatnot. But he really uses this to propel his journey to the presidency forward. So he argues, and kind of Kentucky tags along, that this violates the First Amendment. So therefore, they should be able to nullify or ignore this law, this Alien Sedition Acts. And while they may have been right on this issue, it opens up kind of a can of worms, because John Adams allows a state to avoid conflict to ignore a federal law, and you have the concept of nullification, state ignoring federal law. Here, not a big of a deal, but when federal laws come out about slavery and states think they can ignore them because of this precedent, it creates some dangerous scenarios as we build toward the Civil War. You have martial law. John Marshall's the second. He's the second. Now, martial law, not to be confused with military law, which is going to be spelled different, M-A-R-T-I-A-L. Okay, that's when the military comes in and basically polices the citizens in time of crisis. Martial court were the rulings of John Marshall, who was the second Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Jay was the first. John Marshall definitely much more influential than John Jay. Marbury versus Madison created judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland, supremacy clause. So I'm just going to gloss over these. That means if a federal and state law contradict, federal law wins out. Implied powers, the federal government has powers that are implied in order to that are not explicitly written in the Constitution. Elastic clause, new laws can be added. The Constitution can be stretched like elastic in order to add these laws through things like common law, amendments, and executive orders. Gibbons versus Ogden said that if you sell good from one state to another state, the federal government, not the state government, regulate that. So if we sell a good from Florida to Kentucky, federal government has ultimate say. However, if we would sell a good from Charlotte to Shelby, North Carolina would regulate that. Our first two parties are the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. So it's really kind of easy to understand when you think about the titles. Now, you'll hear me say Democratic Republican. Don't confuse that with today's Democrats, today's Republicans. This was the other name for the Anti-Federalist Party. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, want a strong federal government. The Anti-Federalists are more for individual power and states' rights. Hamilton's the first Secretary of the Treasury for Washington, and then you have Jefferson, who's the first Secretary of State, meaning he handles foreign affairs. Of course, Treasury, you're talking about money, fiscal policy. These two men disagree, they're political rivals, but George Washington likes to surround himself with opposing views to get a full understanding of things. Hamilton comes up with the idea of a national bank. And along with that, you have the excise tax on whiskey that caused the Whiskey Rebellion. So all these states were in massive debt following the Revolutionary War. So what Hamilton's going to do is say the federal government's going to assume that debt, and we are going to, via federal income tax, pay off the debt from the Revolutionary War. And in order to do that, we're going to put a excise, or what we'd call in the South a sin tax, on whiskey. And then the national bank will control all fiscal policy, meaning the printing of money, what would now be the Federal Reserve. But at that time, they printed money, they minted coins, they collected tax money, they paid out tax money, they handled all the money that went in and out of the United States. And it's the McCulloch versus Maryland case that says that the federal government has the implied power to create a national bank. This is definitely Hamilton's biggest legacy. We covered Washington's farewell in the last section, so I'm not going to get in depth here. We didn't listen to any of his advice that he gave throughout his presidency about no foreign alliances, no political parties, no sectionalism. In fact, we ignored all. Of course, we have political parties. We have plenty of foreign alliances. Sectionalism means putting your state or region over your country. We did that building toward the Civil War. More, if you want to look back at the 2.1 notes, you can see it on there as well. So, I mentioned this earlier. Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton handles the money. Jefferson handles foreign affairs on behalf of the president. They have two different views on how government should be run and how it should be favored. Hamilton is more for the wealthy, the elite, the Northeastern. Jefferson for the middle-class common man, even though he was a fairly wealthy man himself. And you have the split to the first two political parties. Now, Washington is labeled a Federalist, but he is in name only. He kind of has to pick a party. He identifies himself more as an American than being affiliated with any political party. In fact, he doesn't like political parties. They want a strong federal government. They want higher taxes. They're for big business. You see, they're pro-tariff, meaning taxes on imports. They're loose pro-British. They're loose interpreters of the Constitution. That means they bend the rules of the Constitution. They read between the lines, if you will. If you know one, you know the other, because the Democratic Republicans are the complete opposite. Jefferson is their leader. They're more for the rural, the farmers, people like that. Definitely more popular in the South and the Northeast. They're more pro-French because Jefferson had a great relationship with Napoleon, had a second home in Paris where they negotiated the Treaty of Paris, and they're strict interpreters of the Constitution. They're constitutionalists. If it doesn't say they can do it, they don't do it in the Constitution. They go by the Constitution word for word. The election of 1800 is one of the first of three things that will signal the end of the Federalist Party. Jefferson beats John Adams, and we have our first non-Federalist president. We have a Democratic Republican who takes over power in 1800. One of the things that Jefferson has to deal with is Barbary Pirates. They attack our trade vessels, our ships that are sending goods to Europe. They loot them, so Jefferson decides that he's going to use our Navy to attack them, and they flee off. Of course, Jefferson weakens them, but it will be Madison who ultimately defeats them. Remember, if you have the strong Navy, you're the dominant world power. We're not there yet, but this shows we're working toward it. So Unit 2, you got not Unit 2, 3.2, excuse me. The Treaty of Greenville, this ended a small Indian battle known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1795. You have these same groups of Indians that once Pontiac led around Ohio that continue to try to fight back, and unfortunately for them, continue to lose. This talks about slavery during the Federalist Era. Of course, there was slavery. The Quakers were the big group that came out against it. It also talks about voting in the Federalist Era. In order to vote at this time, you had to be white, male, 21, and on land. So you're talking only middle and upper class white males who could vote. Of course, women had little rights at this time. Okay, they couldn't vote, couldn't divorce, couldn't own land unless it was inherited. So next we'll cover 3.3, which gets into the War of 1812. Thank you very much for tuning into this. I know you guys have been working hard online for the most part. Keep it up, and remember, always turn in work better late than never. Thank you. Have a good day. Please email any questions to bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. Stay safe.